Everyone is welcome here, it's time to make new friends. Aquavide Uskava, fill your Glencairn. Share a dram with the spirit of Edmonton. Luncha!
Good day, Whiskey brothers, Whiskey sisters, and Whiskey friends, and welcome to the Whiskey Book Club's 6th book of Season 5 with Ralfy Mitchell right beside us, the author of this book right here. Well, I'm going to show you two of them, that book and the same book. So edition 2 and edition 3. And it's called Search for a Whiskey Bothy, a humorous autobiography by Ralfy. As always, I'm honored to have you, the viewer, with us today as well. And I got to say, there's other whiskey book clubs out there right now, not too many, but none that delve so deeply in the subject matter than, and with the author, than right here, and with friends on the side as they come in today. My name's Dolph. I'm the founder of the Whiskey Book Club, president of the Alberta Scotch Society. I'm your host tonight, most importantly at the moment. For those of you a little bit new to the Whiskey Book Club, I'll tell you a little bit what we're about. We're a home base. We're a safe place for whiskey geeks, anoraks, that love to share a dram and share a passion for reading, mostly about whiskey or whiskey-related activities. This book, again, right there, is the 26th book we've reviewed on the Whiskey Book Club. It's also the first of now 3 books that Ralfy has authored. So that's book number 1. Here's book number 2, and Ralfy will talk about them later, but this is stories that didn't make it into this one. And number 3. And this talks about his years working in a certain trade, which is, I don't know if I've ever read a book about this. So this will be very interesting when I finally delve into it. Now, Ralfy has 182,000 subscribers. He's up to 1,116 reviews, and I'm not sure how many extras, but it's staggering how many he's done, because I've done Canadian whiskey reviews. I'm not even up to 100, and I've been doing this for 3 years. He's the co-founder with Roy from Aquavide and Virtual Pub of the OSWAs, so Online Scotch Whiskey Awards, not association. I keep doing that in my head. I'm sorry. And he's with us today. Welcome, Ralfy.
Well, hello there, Dolph. Thank you for inviting me. It's lovely to be joining you. Here I am in the Bothy. I've got the fire on to warm the place up, keep my feet warm. A nice cup of tea to get things started, some soda water, and a nice glass of rum. Not whiskey this evening. Not whiskey. It is actually going to be rum. I do have some rum, whiskey in the shelf, but it's the beginning of March here on the island in the middle of the Irish Sea, and to be honest, it's not that we have cold winters, unlike yourselves in Canada. I mean, you have proper cold winters. We just have grey, miserable, wet winters. And I find myself just looking for alternative moments rather than being 100% whiskey. I do like to shake things up a bit and enjoy a rum now and again, because there's some really good rums out there.
Well, I might join you with a rum later on. I'm starting with this year's Whiskey of the Year. So that's lovely. And do you go to rum when you're in a sweet mood? Is this a sweet mood? Is it more kind of a nighttime? You want to hunker down and the sweetness kind of carries you? Is that what's going on with the rum?
Yeah. Not if the rum is overtly sweet. That is a complete turn off.
Good.
And traditionally, because the majority of rum has been for mixing in cocktails and has been just the legacy of that particular spirit, it has been sweetened up, literally physically sweetened up, by adding sugarcane juice or molasses into the cask with the new make spirit for maturation, or at the end prior to bottling. And this is a common practice, and certainly to the credit of the rum onliners, they have really called out through chemoanalysis the rums that have had sugar added to them, that have basically been juiced up, so as that we can focus in as experienced whiskey drinkers on the better quality rum, or rum in its more natural condition. And it's thank goodness for the independent bottlers, certainly in the UK, because you have the majority of whiskey independent bottlers are featuring rums, and some of these rums are absolutely phenomenal.
I agree completely. And you've convinced me to open this one. So this is Single Cask Nation. It's an 11-year-old Foursquare. So again, independent bottle, which we love. Pretty strong though, because we love our cask strength whiskeys anyway. So this is 55.8%. But this is a lovely bottle. And I've been kind of saving it a little bit, but it was close to me. So my wife and I'll share a dram of that. It's noon here, so it's okay. It's Saturday. We can start having our drams in noon, or having our drams anytime we want. Really,
absolutely wonderful. Have you got time for a little anecdote?
Absolutely. You've got as much time about anything you want to talk about. You're the person that's guiding this. I've got, for those friends that are out there, I've got 17 pages worth of questions for Ralfy. We're probably not going to get through them all. And he's got the floor. So Ralfy, and with any of these questions, if you wanted to bounce back and forth, you don't have to wait for me to get to it. You just bounce to whatever feels natural at the time.
Well, just a little bit in rum at the moment. There's more rum festivals appearing across Europe now because of growing interest in sipping rums. The rum producers, particularly in the Caribbean, are identifying that there's this market where all they have to do is present a rum unfiltered, unhomogenized, uncosmeticized. And generally what they do is they ship the barrels to Liverpool in England.
Okay.
Yeah, which is where I bought 2 barrels of Foursquare about 5 years ago as 10-year-old. In fact, I bottled one recently to celebrate 1,000 reviews. I'm now in Ralfy review 1016, heading on 1017 now. And I actually visited Liverpool, and its main rum, which is actually part of a Dutch company, because the Dutch, for quite a long time, have been the main importers of rum into Europe.
Okay.
Because it's very popular as a flavouring, particularly Jamaican rum from Hamden Distillery, which is highly ester dominant. And it was fascinating to get actually a tour of the warehouse, which was an old brick industrial warehouse in the banks of the Mersey.
Okay.
Where there was so much space that they never had to stack a single cask on top of another. They were all literally on the floor. And it was the smell in there was just absolutely delightful, because as you can imagine, some of the casks were leaking. And it was quite unique, very much part of the legacy, particularly for British style rums. This is molasses rums from the likes of Barbados, from Jamaica, from Guyana, St. Vincent, Grenada. So they kind of make their way into Liverpool. So I bought a couple of casks of Foursquare because, as you've pointed out, it's a wonderfully traditional British molasses style of rum. And the signature that one gets from the distilleries in Barbados, whether it be Foursquare or Mount Gay, or even little St. Nicholas Abbey, although it's quite expensive, but a beautiful place to visit, is this wonderful complex spiciness. And I am noticing at the moment that the caliber of blending at these rum distilleries for whiskey fans is really coming on it's really very impressive. Mount Gay bottled us 2 years ago now. They bottled a version of their rum called Andean Oak. So they got oak. I mean, there's oak in South America. So because it's got high altitude, in the mountains, in the Andes, and it's wonderfully aromatic. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of the resinous nature of Scottish oak, which isn't really suitable for making casks because it's slow growing and quite knotty.
Okay.
Anyway, I mustn't waffle on here. Back to you.
You can waffle on that all you want. I just grabbed another one, and on the side, maybe I'll open this one and say it was the Boutique Rum Company, and this is Casa Santana, Colombia. So, and it was the first time I'd ever heard of this distillery. And how do you reconcile, though? Because with Scotch, we love the fact that 12 means the minimum age is 12. How do you reconcile that with rum, though, knowing that 21 could be 2 and a little bit of 21? Are you okay with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's straight back to the distilleries. There are distilleries, particularly in South America, where the age statement will refer to the oldest rum in the batch. And you see this, the clues are in the standard bottling strength 40%, which is absolutely useless. I mean, if anybody's wanting to get into sipping rum and they see a bottle of rum that looks lovely and rich and it's in a glass flask and it's all kind of tarted up a little bit, and it's 40% or even worse, 38%, you just walk away, forget it. That is your first serious clue that you're dealing with a homogeneous bar rum for dark and stormies and mojitos and all the rest of it. So you're really looking at the custom and practice of the British-based independent bottlers who will actually put honest age statements on their product because they don't want people to make the mistake of thinking that if they take, say, 2 barrels of rum, one's 5 years old and one's 15 years old, then they call it a 15-year-old. People will turn around and say, well, hang about, if you do that with rum, what are you doing with your whiskey? You know, they're not going to take that risk. The independent bottlers, particularly at the moment when they simply don't have the quality of access to casks of Scotch single malt, because more and more single malt producers, distilleries are holding on to their stock and not making them available to independent bottlers. Then they're looking elsewhere at discovering whiskies from across Europe, from Amérique, for example, in France, from Millstone in Holland, which is great stuff. I mean, I'm going to hand it to them. They, you know, whether it's rum or whether it is whiskey or whatever, at the end of the day, it's all about the quality of the cask. It's the cask that ultimately, and the longer the spirit's in the cask, the more important the caliber of that cask becomes.
And we have to have trust in those. Well, we equate that. We do have trust in certain independent bottlers and mills and distilleries. But if I'm buying my first from them and it's 25-year-old, but you find out that there's 8-year-old as the majority of the rum, that will turn me off. It will. And no matter how much I like it, it'll just turn me off because I'm kind of like that. I'm finicky. But I'm going to get on to the book. Ralfy, can you hold up the back of your first book, please?
Yes.
The 840s, because that's edition 1. I just wanted to explain this to people before. So this is edition 2, but it's got the orange back. And edition 3, this one right here. Now, this is the one right now. And you mentioned in your prologue, Helen Keneen, who I think you paid with Scotch, helped you with the prologue. And can you tell us how this is different from this one? And is it solely the editing, or is it some of the beautification of it? And this looks fantastic as well, because I like how it suits the series one after the other. It looks very well. And your 4th book and 5th, when they come out eventually, I'm hoping have the same theme to the front. But tell us what Helen did for you, please.
Well, the whole experience of self-publishing, because I'm not the sort of person that a traditional publisher would be interested in. And bearing in mind that I'm probably one of the early generation onliners, independent onliners, who, although I'm definitely connected to the whiskey industry, certainly after, 14, coming on 15 years. I do keep a distance to keep an independence, and it's the internet which has allowed a member of Glasgow's Whisky Club back in the early 2000s to have a platform which never existed before. And there's no way, with the sort of person I am, that the whiskey industry would have allowed me to be sort of a brand ambassador or a recognized authority representing them, because I'm really just not the right sort. I'm frankly too opinionated, and I understand where they're coming from.
Sure.
You know, they've got to look after business, and they want someone who, if they're delivering bad news, does it very delicately, and very tactfully, and at times just doesn't stray too far from the script. And this is real life. I'm not judging in any way, Dolph. This is just the way the world is.
Well,
So
if they're paying you to do something, they expect to be able to tell you what to say. I think that's the way it goes. That's why you don't accept the bottles from people, because there's that that contract that people don't. It might not be a signed contract. You haven't shaken anyone's hand, but maybe you think you deserve to get, or they deserve something. But I agree with you. I'll let you continue with that. Sorry.
But this was an off-the-cuff remark in one of my videos back in 2019.
Okay.
And I happened to say, do you know, with all the experiences over the years, I could write a book about this. And then, of course, I had this flurry of comments under the video saying, hey, Ralfy, if you write a book, I'll buy it. And I thought, right, well,
why not?
We know that the option exists to self-publish, which, I mean, this is only 4 years into self-publishing, so it's still finding its feet in its own level and establishing itself. And although Amazon is a behemoth and it is what it is the one platform that really not only allows a writer to self-publish, but actually gives them some support in the distribution and handling all the paperwork, administration, and tax returns that a traditional publisher would do. So I did approach a couple of book agents, but they were really not interested because, understandably, book publishers are looking for books that they feel are definitely going to sell, which means books by the sort of books that Charlie MacLean and Dave Broom and Ian. They're great books, and also there's no point in me trying to replicate what they've already done, because I wouldn't do it as well, and people have already bought a better book. So I realized, well, you know, let's make this almost anecdotal, circumstantial. So I wrote a few notes, ripped them up, started again, and after about the third attempt, I just discovered this momentum. And of course, this is really happening just before pandemic lockdown.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, people are at home. They're not going to bars. They're not going to hotels. They're not going to whiskey clubs.
They're starving for something.
They're looking for content and distraction. And how about a whiskey book? So the first book I wrote, the first version, the first edition, was restricted to 840 copies before I pulled the plug on it, because I'd written it out, I'd checked it over, I checked the spelling, and I realized I need an editor. But of course, I've never done this before.
Right.
I contacted a few people for advice, but it was very vague. So I picked up an editor on Fiverr.com, where it's like a website, a platform where you go to people and hire their services in whatever they specialize in. And she had this editor already had some good ratings. She was a Florida school teacher.
Okay.
My goodness, what a mistake that was. It was just dreadful. It was basically, the script was sent back with cut this out, cut that out. You don't need to say this. Reword it this way, reword it that way. And I thought, I'm wasting my time here. So I went online and discovered a retired civil servant who edited books. But I have to say,
Frank?
Yeah, Frank.
Okay.
Bless him. A characterful, grumpy old chap who did a basic job. Right. Moving on. So we had the first book, and this is a copy edition full of spelling mistakes. But do you know, people adopted it as the blooper book. Once it was established there was only 840 copies. People actually wanted it because it was the very first.
I did as well. And I wanted the signature because you signed them all. So I wanted the signature as well.
Yes.
If I've got edition 2 and edition 3, you got to have edition 1. So I'll pick it up one day, maybe. But yeah, I'm sure they'll be on auctions at one point in time.
Yes. And of course, with the first edition, Dolph, you get the stamp beside my signature.
Yep.
And this is an idea I took from an established writer called Terry Pratchett, who does fantasy books, quite famous in the UK. And what he would do is he'd have a nice fancy stamp, and then he'd sign beside it so that people got a little bit more. They got something a little bit more unique. Yep. So I commissioned off of eBay for about £15 this stamp saying, "Thank you for buying my book," or something to that effect.
First edition, maybe something like that.
First edition, something like that.
Yeah.
But by the second edition, people were coming back saying, "There's a spelling mistake here, grammar's wrong," and I'm thinking, what's going on here? You know, I'm using a decent software program here, an established one that real writers use, and I've done all my spelling checks. So how come there's still spelling mistakes? And the fact was, no system is
full
without its flaws. So I had to then consider the third edition, but I had the benefit of the first and now the second edition. And the third edition was definitely went through Amazon, better paper, better quality of printing, better lineup, better quality of cover. And at this point, I had someone in a library, funnily enough, it was a librarian, says, "Well, hang about, I know this person that she lives in France, but she'll edit the book for you." And, you know, she was absolute godsend. Name's Alison. And she sorted out the formatting, right? And with this book, before I sent it for editing / formatting, I asked one of my friend's mothers, who's a legal secretary, if she could edit for me in exchange for whiskey, which she was happy to do. I think she really quite enjoyed the novelty of the experience. Name's Helen Keneen, and she did a much improved job over the originals. And the rest, as they say, is history, because the book cover designer, his name's James, lives an Englishman in Barcelona. Who, you know, basically I said, well, I want to have the books kind of looking kind of old-fashioned contemporary, but distinctive and sort of matching each other. And it worked out an absolute treat. In fact, when I just gave him the photograph and said, you know, just do what you want, what you think's appropriate, he came back with a concept which is even better than I'd even originally thought about or considered. So he did a fantastic job. So at this point, I've now got my contacts where I've got someone that can really format, really design a book cover, because they're professionals at it. And I know my way around the Amazon system, and I can actually watch online where my book sales are taking place, whether in Australia, Japan, Brazil, Romania, or in Germany. You know, it's you get far more feedback than you do in other online publishers. How long that will last, goodness knows. But this is part and parcel of the internet generation, and a lot of whiskey enthusiasts, whether they're creating their own podcasts, video conferencing. They're way ahead of the distilleries themselves, because by and large, the insightfulness, not the quality, but the insightfulness and delivery from the majority of distilleries is still far too restrained and almost apologetic. And they're just not, in fact, any distillery, if they want to gain traction for their brand, particularly new distilleries, what they want to do is just go along to a whiskey festival and chat to the geeks. Go on to forums, whether it be on Reddit or Discord or even the old-fashioned Facebook platform, and just listen in to what the enthusiasts are saying, and they're going to learn an awful lot from that. In fact, far more than they're ever going to get from so-called industry consultants.
And I'm wondering, have they approached you actually afterwards? You've got 3 books now. They've sold fairly well. And you've mentioned online that you're seeing your books in bookstores, presentations of your books in bookstores. So has anyone approached you about a 4th book or future books, or representing you now that you've done it all yourself?
Yeah, I have been given quite a few nudges for the 4th book, because there's certainly topics that I can go back to. In looking at historical fact and fictionalizing it while retaining true to the authenticity of the history, and using my proximity of living in Glasgow for so long and being acquainted with whiskey folk who worked in the industry down in the local bar where I lived, in a little borough called Partick, which was a fantastic, very traditional place. That there's definitely quite a lot of material that can be woven into stories. But funnily enough, I'm thinking that possibly my next drinks related book may well be a rum travelogue, because I am showing more interest in rum, and rum distillers are noticing me more, because I'm, unlike many whiskey commentators that tend to stick to whiskey, I'm more than happy to objectively review, enjoy, and talk in some detail about different rums, because the character and the substance is definitely out there. And as I mentioned earlier, briefly, that we're seeing in the UK the development of rum festivals, which, interestingly, they have excuse the pun, they have a different flavour of experience.
They do.
Literally, you walk in, you will see the little made-up tiki bars and little kind of rum shack type things. You will see the plastic pineapples and bananas, which I have to say is fantastic, because when a whiskey drinker goes to a rum festival, they don't want the reproduction of a whiskey festival. They want it to be more almost cliched, in the best way, in the right way. And it just, you get to a certain extent, you get at rum festivals now what you used to get at whiskey festivals 15 years ago.
All right. Well, I'm going to have to see them if they come to our parts of the world. Well, they might already have, but
they will.
I'm going to jump into the book. Because you're going to see I like to do this a lot. I'll throw a quote up if I may.
Yeah.
Here we go. So this is right away. Page 1. The expression of true contentment on my father's face as he sat during winter insights in front of a gas fireplace, listening to Renaissance music, playing on his record player, whilst carefully sipping malt whiskey from a little thimble glass. It was a moving sight to an impressionable boy. So that's page 1. So revisiting this quote 4 years later, because I read this back then, 2019, I think, right away. I think this came out maybe in November, and I read this in March. So it was pretty soon. it brings two things to mind. So you describe your adventure of raiding your father's liquor cabinet to get that memorable bottle of Top Dog rum. And the rum goes perfectly with what we're talking about now. So the rum was your first. We would have thought that it would have been whiskey, but the first one you took was the rum. Do you have that type of memory where you can recall situations and actions with clarity? Or in the book, are you filling in blank spots with what you think is logical, almost fully formed? So eidetic memory or really good memory, just filling it in? I'm wondering which one for you.
It's absolutely legitimate memory, because I have strong memories of certain events in childhood. Of course, I don't have much memory of school, because school's pretty awful for any kid.
As you're talking to a math teacher here, I'm sorry, Ralfy, for all the teachers that have done that to you in the past.
Well, at least you're teaching something useful, something that actually matters, because maths is the pure language of the universe.
Yeah.
But going to school and listening to the history and the indoctrination for the so-called education, and we're talking about the 1960s here. So this was the baby boomer time, where the classes were about 35 students, pupils. The teachers were kind of fairly exasperated. A lot of the old teachers were Second World War shell-shocked survivors. Were still carrying the splinters in their legs. You know, this is all living memory stuff. But so I don't have a lot of memory of that. But the fact that my father was a librarian, and what he did was, people who were book collectors or specialists, he do research for them. Now, there wasn't many people doing that sort of thing, because he had contacts with book repairs, because they had those specialists. He worked in the largest reference library in Europe, the Mitchell Library at Charing Cross, which is just literally up the road from the Bon Accord Whisky Bar. And so they had their own book restoration department. So he had access to the knowledge of, what was involved in book restorations and authenticating books, because you'd be surprised at how many fake books are out there. And as a reward, of course, he didn't get cash. He'd get a bottle of whiskey from a grateful client. So I remember there was 8-year-old Rosebank was one of them. This is the 1960s. Rosebank, St. Magdalen, Springbank, and of course Macallan. Macallan was, at that point, it was the status single malt. But of course, if you really were going to be a total connoisseur about it, you were into the peated whiskies. So he did have a bottle of Lafroig, which really enjoyed, but he never added water. It went into a liqueur glass, so he could portion control it and make it last. And of course, with it, he just happened to, I can smell the stuff. You're a kid, you get super senses when you're a kid. And I would walk in the room and I could smell it immediately. And I found it fascinating, because it was an olfactory picture, a recreation of a picture, an image of hillsides, peat bogs, windswept moors, that sort of stuff. So it wasn't long before, as a 4-year-old, I did go sneak into the guests' room, so I wasn't allowed in there. It's all the best of stuff. And I went into the cabinet, and sure, I had a tiny wee drop of the whiskey, which was awful. The old dog, which was actually the name of a British warship at one point. And Britain's always had a very strong connection between rum and the Royal Navy and the nautical history, as you see still in existence today with Pussers, which is basically the independent bottler bottling what's left through Royal Navy contracts. As far afield as Australia, Guyana, and Jamaica, and Barbados, of course.
And I like it. And we're talking more about rums, and I'm surprised at the amount of rums that I actually have talking to you. It's kind of funny. So the Pussers rum, just like you mentioned there, and the little one, which was they're lovely. I love collecting these.
Yeah. By the way, you'll generally find that rums weather better in ceramic flasks than whiskey. Because inevitably the inside of the glaze in these bottles, because it's done industrially, is perfect. And rum, because of its viscosity and density, particularly molasses rum, which is generally what you get in these kind of collector's flasks and commemorative editions, the rum takes on a minerality. And it's something that's been discussed in the fact that the British Navy, when they were storing rum at Portsmouth, in the Portsmouth docks, and Royal Navy requisitioning warehouses, they would store them in flagons, in ceramic flagons bound with wicker cane basket, which seems a kind of fairly expensive way of doing it. But this goes really back to the days of the British Navy rum ration, which was discontinued in 1974 when they started loading nuclear weapons onto battleships.
Well, smart.
Yeah, very smart.
It's fun.
But what really appealed to me, what fascinated me in that cabinet was the Kahlua, which is Mexican coffee liqueur. The label was interesting because it looked Arabic, it looked Middle Eastern, but it said Hecho o Mexico or Mexico. And so it's Mexican coffee liqueur. And, I bought a bottle of rum a number of years ago called Mercado. That's the stuff.
Stuff there.
By the way, a wee recommendation to anybody is when you're at whiskey auctions and online auctions, always look at the liqueurs that are on sale. Because liqueurs, because of the amount of sugar in them, they tend to bottle condition very, very successfully. In fact, there's many connoisseurs in Europe, particularly in France and Belgium, who are on the lookout for old bottles or vintage bottles of Cointreau, because essentially, like an Armagnac, they have glass aged and glass conditioned over the years, and then they turn up at auction, and they have this extra dimension. It's what the whiskey enthusiasts that are into that call OBE, or old bottle effect. And it's definitely a thing. I've come across it myself on numerous occasions. And but anyway, you've already sussed already, Dolph, that I do tend to litter on a bit. So
we're here to talk.
I'll let you go to your next question.
I'm going back to your childhood. I'm trying to find the effect, how you got into it. So I'm still going to go back to that first quote. I had it up there. I'll put it back up there. And so the second part that I was coming back to, because father-son relationships, they can be pretty complex. But can you tell me what had the biggest impact when you saw your father there, and possibly your future with scotch or whiskey? Was it him being content, happy at that point, the scotch itself, the smell, the music, the fireplace in the winter, some combination of them all, or none of them? What made you possibly feel that it was a comfortable thing?
It was a completely inarticulate, non-definable realization that alcohol, particularly at higher strength, carries incredible complexity of essence.
But you didn't think of that. Sorry, I'm mixing this up, because really you came back to whiskeys with your bottle of Bells, and you brought the information. You made notes about the Bells when the salesperson, the brand representative, came to your flat. He gave out, I think you said 30 bottles within the neighborhood. You're the only one to bring yours back with the notes. And that seems like at that time that you liked whiskey and that you might come back to it. But I'm wondering what made you open to the idea in the first place. And was that Dad and just the nice feeling around it?
No,
No, it's just trying it. Okay.
It's just one of these peculiar happenstances that if you try and articulate it in terms of family relationships, it actually misdirects you.
Okay.
And you start to kind of put the round peg into a square hole, and it's just not fitting.
Okay.
When I was a student at college, I was studying catering initially. That's how I started.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it was red wine because it was, and bottles of Thunderbird, by the way, which is a notorious cheap
blend
alcohol just to get you pished. And like everybody else, I'd started off, late teens, early 20s, just, you're out with your mates, you get pished. But I was never comfortable with the dizziness that comes with intoxication. And I was never comfortable with the banality, blandness, and superficiality of the flavors and the sweetness of the majority of bottled junk for passive consumers.
Okay.
So I migrated on to back to rum, funnily enough. So there's the British independent bottlings of rum, including Lamb's, OVD, and Woods, which were legacy. I mean, they still exist now. OVD in particular was a well-known brand. And at that point in the 1980s, because the fashion was for Camparis, vodkas, and whatever. And also Baby Sham, if you remember that.
Baby Sham.
Baby Sham was a bland perry.
Okay.
It was a precursor. It was primarily a ladies' drink of that generation, which was a precursor to Prosecco.
Okay. All right.
And it was very bland, accessible, pretty disgusting.
It sounds like something we had called Baby Duck. I don't know if you had that, but it was pink. Sorry, there was different colors, I believe, but pink. And I remember as a child, this sounds bad, but in probably the early 1970s, going to the corner store and buying that for my mother for a present for Christmas. That's the memory. Well, I could afford, I think it was $2 or $3, whatever it is. I would shovel walks because we had a lot of snow in Montreal where I was growing up, and that was the Christmas present. It's funny you bring that up. So I wonder if that's the same thing, same bottle, different name, different country. Baby Duck for us. Right.
So and Baby Sham, it had on the label this kind of small fawn, this kind of cartoonish fawn, as a brand recognition device.
Okay.
But this was the age of vodka and something and Bloody Marys and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And of course, bars were pumping the mixers because people would drink more and people would pay more. There was very little interest in sipping whiskies unless you went to a traditional Glasgow bar, where people were still, particularly the older generation, it's still the habit to have a half and a half, which is a half of blended Scotch whiskey, usually Bell's or something that's kind of cheap and readily available, or house blend like Old High Commissioner. That's another good one.
Okay.
With a half pint of beer. So they have the beer to wash down the whiskey and vice versa.
Beer chaser.
A chaser, absolutely. But the malts were for weddings, for golf club bars. You'd have, and it was very status orientated. So the blue collar worker would end up with a half bottle of High Commissioner in their pocket, or Grants, something like that, or Bell's. And the white collar office junior would aspire at the end of the year to see in the new year with a bottle of famous grouse, right?
That's good.
And then the teacher would have a bottle of Glenlivet or Glenfiddich.
No teachers for teachers?
Teachers was a bit of an anomaly, actually, and it's one of these bottles well worth looking out for at auction, because at one point it was one of the highest quality, most characterful blended scotches out there, being a minimum of 45% single malt from the distillery of Ardmore. And this is something that, again, when you go in auction, and I would recommend that if people see in Canada at auction old bottles of Canadian Club, for example, or Wisers, that they give it a second glance, actually, because in previous generations, the yields were lower, things were less scientific, and therefore there was more flavour coming out the more primitive grain varieties.
I had the good chance at the Victoria Whisky Festival just, I think, a month ago now. It's been a little bit. Same thing. So whiskeys from the 1970s and comparing them to their brethren now, the newer ones, and so much caramel on the palate. It's deeper, richer. The mouth feels fantastic, but definitely more caramelly and richer. I was pleasantly surprised at what would have been a cheaper bottle in the 1970s. So I agree with you completely.
And it's also a legacy experience, because there's no other commodity. Nobody's going to buy a tin of pineapple chunks in the 1950s and open it and try and eat them.
Right.
The only literally palatable, safe consumption of historical items is through high-strength alcohol, unless you find an old jar of honey. I mean, they found it in Egyptian tombs. They found ceramic pots of honey, which still has honey in it, because honey lasts for thousands of years. But,
that would be interesting.
Well, quite.
Imagine being the person that actually notices that and finds it. I wonder if they take a taste. I wonder. They're not supposed to, obviously, but I wonder if that person takes just a little something to try it. I would.
Yeah. I suspect what they do is have fascinating analysis of the residue of pollens and the spectral analysis, chemospectral analysis of that honey, because that would be preserved within it.
They would be.
But it's not unreasonable that someone will open a bottle of cognac, for example, that's 200 years old, and it's a perfectly potable experience. And you find this with some of the, particularly the old Irish whiskies, which were bottled at higher strength and have literally survived because of the provenance of a cooler, damper climate, with kind of more even cellar temperatures, that you can taste spirits from 100 years old. I mean, obviously, there's one really good example is the Shackleton bottlings that were found at under
the castle,
under the wooden hut in Antarctica.
Oh, sorry.
They discovered in the permafrost these bottles of whiskey, which were completely intact, because high-strength alcohol, when it gets really, really cold, it just goes slushy, because alcohol has such a low freezing temperature.
Right.
If it had been wine, the bottles would have broken and it wouldn't have survived. And some of the bottles were returned to White and Mackay, who are now the brand owners of the Shackleton blended Scotch brand. And it was their master blender, Richard Patterson, who kind of analysed it. And then he was allowed the freedom to recreate it as the Shackleton blend, which, because he was given free rein to do so, the first bottlings that come in the wooden box with the bits of straw are absolutely fantastic.
Well, and when did that come out, Ralfy?
Well, last year, you're talking about, 12, 14 years ago?
Okay.
It didn't last very long, and it was more a novelty, so there wasn't a lot of it.
Well, and there was other Irish whiskies that were coming out. Napogue Castle had the same thing. It was in the wooden with the straw, and they were just trying, I think, work off of that. But I'm going to get on to the next question. I'm bringing us back to the book. And we're going to talk about the 1980s now. So chapter 2 brings us to the 80s. You're a young man. And I see a couple patterns that seem to repeat themselves with you throughout the book and throughout the videos I see with you. So for one, you're up for an adventure. If it's a motorcycle or something else, you're up for an adventure and you seem to have good luck. Now, Sanny, and we'll talk about Sanny others, him offering scotch is an example for you going into some place and then you going from bells to having good scotch. And if you say you're going to do something like bring back notes, you actually do something. So that's very nice. You don't drink to get drunk, but like me, maybe you're not particularly adverse to enjoying a lot of it. And maybe you go over a little bit, but that happens. Every once in a while, right? But I'm unclear about some things, and I'd like to know this because I get a little bit mixed messages. I think I know the answer, but I want to know from you. Do you enjoy bars as much as your Bothy on occasions? And do you enjoy the company of others as much as your introspective time sometimes? Or will you always prefer, and you quote from page 110, prefer to drink on your own? So are there times, and if you do have those times, pick them out for me if you can.
Yeah. It depends on the bar, depends on the company, because there's nothing worse than being surrounded by people who aren't particularly pleasant when they're sober, and they're certainly a lot worse when they're pished. This is the risk in a public bar. Not only that, but public bars are smelly places. The amount of overuse of perfumes and the lack of glass hygiene of some bars. I'm very picky about which bars I go to. Now, there's one bar. I live in an island. I go to one bar. I know the folk there. I go at a certain time where I can actually hear myself think, and I can have an intelligent conversation with someone I already know, or even better, with a complete stranger.
Okay.
It is a brief a meeting. It is self-contained, and it's wonderful, and I thoroughly enjoy that. And I make sure that if I'm in my local bar, I'll buy a glass of, or even a double of whiskey. And I know they've got some good whiskey there because I gave them the bottle to put in the shelf.
Here, hold on to this. Someone will like this, or me when I come back in a month or two. It's okay. Yeah. We do that here as well. Well, the bar is called the Bothy in Edmonton, so it's great. And I'm the president of the Alberta Scotch Society. So what I do for our members is we bring a bottle to the Bothy, and our members show up and they show their membership card and they get a free dram, essentially, of something like that. But I like the fact that you bring something to someone else. You want to share it with other people because you don't bring it to the bar and tell them to put under the table. It's at the bar and it's there for consumption or trial for other people as well.
It is really down as to the bar. I won't wander into any bar because it can be a very cosmetic, superficial experience, and I've been spoiled. When you've been in really good bars like the Bon Accord in Glasgow, or the Rosemount, for example, in Edinburgh, and you know what a really good bar is, you go into a mediocre bar and you immediately pick up on the relentless flashing lights of the gambling machines.
VLT for us,
yeah. The overly simplistic, over brightened colors of some football match or some other sporting event, which is on television, and you're chatting to someone and they barely look at you because they're too busy with their eyes glued to the screen. That's no use. It's just not me. I didn't mind what bar I was in when I was a student. When I was out to have a good few drinks, have a laugh, do something silly, and then go home and sleep it off.
Yep.
Right, Joe. Job done. But as soon as I started working, it was a much more controlled situation. I'd go to the Smitty, which was a spoiled for choice of bars and Partick, very traditional bars. And I'm really pleased to see that many of them are still there and still retain the authenticity of their character. They have that feel when you walk in the door. And I'd go into the Smithy, and the bar ran down the right-hand side, and you had these fine old acid-etched Victorian windows on the left. It had proper brass pumps for the beer, and you got proper cask-conditioned ales because the bar person had been doing it all their life. They didn't know anything else, and they took pride in their work because it was a family-owned pub, and they were in there, so long as they kept their nose clean and balanced the books at the end of the month, nobody cared. And that mattered. So James the barman, he would pour me a glass of Younger's number 3, phenomenal old school pint.
Yep.
And I finished my work. I wasn't one for heading straight home to watch television and all the banality of that. It's, you know, it was all that was really available then until the internet came along. But to go out and actually kind of socialize a little bit, chat to a few strangers, meet some of the ladies that kind of ask, they'd ask, how are you getting on with your new job as an undertaker? They were very curious, especially after a few pink gins. And of course, they'd been along at the spiritualist church, so they were very much in tune with contacting people beyond the grave. And this is just what it was. This is what was in this bar. And you had Sanny at the end, who was a miserable, cantankerous, ill-natured, bitter old cooper who'd been doing that his whole life. And he'd been demobbed from the army. He'd had a bad experience, and he nursed his wrath to keep it warm, and occasionally would lapse into bouts of violent drunkenness, at which point he was barred. But he was the person, and I was, as I mentioned, the only person who went in with the notes from this, with this bottle of Bell's Islander. You see, the standard Bell's is non-peated.
Right.
Bell's Islander was an experiment by the whiskey producers at the time in the 1980s, when nobody was wanting to buy whiskey, to make it more exciting. So they basically put Kulila in it and made it a bit more peaty. So I picked up in this. So I went in with my tasting notes, and it was James the barman. He's nodding away with his reading glasses on, with the bar towel over his shoulder, going, "Oh yeah, that's right. Absolutely, you're quite right." And of course, Sanny picks up in this, and he jumps in because he's not really met anybody in Partick in Glasgow that isn't just swigging back the whiskey and saying, "Oh, that's delicious," and moving on to the next round. Yep. This is someone that's actually taking it slowly. Then he points up in the shelf to the Bunnahabhain, and then I start to give tasting notes in the Bunnahabhain, and this is what's called happenstance. This is just the absurd, specific peculiarity of a certain place, a certain person, in a certain place, in a certain time, in a certain situation, and it happens to us all the time. We never notice it.
But you're open to the experience, and you're open to that.
And I've never not been open to the experience, because it migrated. It didn't stop there, as it would for many people. It led me to the specialist whiskey shops like Oddbins, for example, who at that point had some phenomenally priced, superb whiskies, your Broras, your independent bottlings of 30-year-old, 40-year-old Glengrants. These great legacy bottles, which are missing now, or even if they exist, they're far too high a price for what they are. And there they are sitting there. I can buy them, and I can start to relate to them, because Sanny I've been down in the bus, literally off the bus, cardboard box full of discarded samples that they didn't want in the blending house. So they just, send them, just get rid of them, get shot of them, put them in a dumpster somewhere. But of course, the staff are saying, hang about, we can sell these for holiday money. if we sell this horrible over-flavored whiskey, it lets us go out and get a nice bottle of Bacardi. And this is what it is. And of course, you're getting some of these, and it's written in pencil in these sample bottles. You know, Highland Park, Macallan, Tamdhu, for example, and I'm trying to get my nose around it, and I'm getting absolutely nowhere, because that's what happens when you start.
Yeah,
you just do not have your bearings, and furthermore, you can't rush it, Dolph. You've got to take your time and let it arrive at its own pace, because we've got to kind of let our senses just settle down and get over that maelstrom of complexity to be able to articulately analyze. And therefore,
I'm going to ask you if it's the same as me, because I say the same things to people, but in my opinion, it's as we grow older, our taste buds become not more attuned, but maybe less. I don't know. Let's explain this with cheese. I don't know if as a child you ever had blue cheese, but blue cheese for me as a child, completely overpowering. And I thought maybe because my taste buds have dulled over time, it not become more attuned, but not as, I don't know. I think it's because we've maybe hurt our taste buds a little bit with the amount of alcohol, dulled them, so that they can taste certain things without being overpowered. Does that work for you? Because that's what I explain to people in my mind.
If we want to hurt our taste buds, we just follow a modern, highly processed supermarket diet of refined breakfast cereals,
sugar,
and tins of Monster energy drink. I mean, that's disgusting. What I do notice is that younger people are developing mature palates a lot quicker than they used to.
That's true.
For a specific reason, and that is the internet. Sipping single malt whiskies is quite cool again. It's an understated sign of sophistication. And the more we wean ourselves off the sanitized sweetness of the illness-inducing modern diet, the more we reawaken the other sensation ranges. And the last one to awaken is bitter savory. So let's go back to blue cheese. Blue cheese is umami. It's distinctive umami. And also it can be sour stroke bitter umami.
Okay.
Depending on the sort of the blue cheese. But when you look at the sensation range, sweet, sour, salt, savory, and bitter, the one that people starting with whiskey find most accessible is sweetness. And therefore, it's very easy for someone getting into a whiskey to enjoy the Oloroso or PX sherry cask matured, whatever, the sherry monster, the big raisin Christmas cake type experience. It's very easy to get your bearings with that. What's far more of a challenge, once you've graduated onto sweet and sour, with more intensity of sour, then a little bit of bitterness in it, but very restrained, is something that's distinctively bitter. That is the biggest challenge for people as they're developing their palates. And bitterness with umami, a bitter savory, is highly unusual. We just don't get it in the modern diet. And therefore, it's something that we have to kind of generate ourselves. For example, it's something I'll feature in my own channel later this year, is actually a deep dive into isolating the sensations.
Okay.
Isolating sweetness is very simple. You just get a bag of sugar. There's no flavor in a bag of sugar. None. It's 100% sensation, the sensation of sweetness. Bitter, sour, sweet and sour, readily accessible because it's Chinese food. Chinese food, the sweet and sour sauce, sweet and sour, a little bit of spice, a little bit of chili. People can get their palate around that very well. But bitterness, where do you actually, what can you consume that's genuinely bitter? Virtually nothing. So we have to go onto eBay and buy a bag of wormwood. Wormwood is a stringent herb. It's called Artemis vulgaris.
Vulgaris. It's full. Yep.
And the common mugwort.
And so not amethyst.
Absinthe.
Absinthe. Sorry.
Yeah,
Nice
absolutely.
green absinthe, and have that with you. Oh.
Yeah, if you buy a proper absinthe, in other words, proper absinthe are not bright green, so they don't glow in the dark. So when you buy a proper absinthe, you're getting this balance of not just wormwood, but gentian is another wonderfully complex, beautiful flavor and sensation delivering experience. Now, the French are aware of it. The Italians, in particular, are aware of it. They're comfortable with these, but in the UK and the US, and to a certain extent Canada, we are so overloaded with the banality of sweetness because it's a great way of engineering in the illusion of flavor into a commodity to cut costs. Right?
Salt as well. That MSG salt is the same thing. Yeah.
Salted toffee ice cream, salted toffees. It's been fashionable for how long now? Sweet and salt. Fantastic.
My whole life.
But
and I ate too much of it as a child as well. I'm going to bring us back to Sanny. One quick, because I don't want to forget about Sanny, because I think your opinion changed of him over time a little bit. He was cantankerous but maybe when you saw that he passed away and the lackluster hearse and maybe you wanting more for him at the end, maybe that's what brought you into becoming a trainee funeral director at the time. So was that kind of the link? Because I think you had a place in your heart for him, even though he's cantankerous. I mean, he brought you somewhere. I'm not going to say father-like figure, but he's someone, an older gentleman that you kind of looked up to in certain ways. For me, I would have loved to have helped or been with him when he was a cooper and actually learned parts of that trade, because we don't have very many coopers in Canada. I think that would have been fantastic. But I think you had that. So is that what brought you into this trade? And then I haven't read it, so maybe he's in here a little bit. I don't know. We'll see.
Frankly, no.
Okay.
Purely happenstance.
Okay, I was looking for that link.
It's purely happenstance that, in fact, what got me into the funeral side of things was the fact that an elderly neighbor, had passed away, and I went down to pay my respects because it's what a good neighbor does.
Yep.
And because I lived in a tenement with nine front doors, the traditional sense of community was still there. And I always made sure that I would go out and brush the landing and be noisy about it and do it when I knew people were at home and they could tell that I was doing my bit to look after the close. So I went down to the local parlour, I viewed, and then roughly at that time, I was made redundant from managing a restaurant. I had applied for a few other jobs, clearly saw I just it wasn't going anywhere. And then it was my elderly neighbour one floor down called Margaret, who actually were sitting down in the local tea room. She's picked up a newspaper, the job's there, trainee funeral director, and I just applied for it because I'm thinking, well, I've been made redundant and I've never heard of any undertakers getting made redundant.
It's true.
It's not going to happen.
Perfect job.
So at that point, I just applied, not thinking for 1 minute I was going to get the job. And then I ended up getting the job. And then that introduced me to a particular intensity of reality that is simply not on many people's radar, because you're dealing with a photo framed insight into complete strangers' lives, which gives an awful lot of detail and is emotionally charged.
And draining as well, I'm guessing. At the end of the day, that could be very draining.
Yeah, well, it could be draining, but it never really felt draining because
to
be honest, I just had a knack for it. I just had the disposition for it to be sympathetic without being overbearing, and to be thorough. Most importantly, when I make arrangements, I was very thorough. I ticked all the boxes. I made sure that I addressed every question articulately, properly, and I made sure that I delivered as much of a personal service as I could, being part of a large funeral provider. I mean, I worked for the Co-op in Glasgow, and at one point they were doing 70% of the city's funerals.
Wow.
You know, we're talking the largest single funeral provider in Europe. The second year I was there, we conducted over 6,500 funerals in 1 year.
Oh, wow.
Now, that's not just your local community funeral director.
Right.
This is an operation which is an incredibly precise, experience-driven operation where you've got an awful lot to learn. There's no sat-nav. You know, you've got to start to memorize streets like a taxi driver. You need knowledge. What you do is you go out and you buy a fold-out street map of Glasgow. You lay it out on the carpet, you get your felt tip markers, and you say, right, there's the river running from left to right. There's the north of the city, the south of the city, the east of the city, the west of the city. Right, where's the main trunk roads going? If I memorize the main trunks roads first, like Great Western Road or Pollokshaws Road, these major arteries, then I'll know where I'm going, because you don't get a dress rehearsal with a funeral. You've got to get it right.
No.
You've got to know where you're going. And even with your fold out A to Z in the front, you've got to know how to read it within seconds.
Well, they're so emotionally charged. The people you're dealing with at that time, and they have expectations and they want it done right. But I think that would have been a good job for you, because you seem very methodical in what you do and how you deal with people. So, but again, there was an opportunity and you took the opportunity, and that's one of the things I'm still seeing with you. And I'm going to stick with that for a little while, because, and I'll try to find the other ones, because everyone's presented with opportunities in life, but do you grab it or do you not grab it? And you're the type that does. But I'm going to go on, and I'm going to talk about a part of your book called, the notes part up top. So you say notes and you put something. And I didn't realize the relevance of notes until I read the third chapter. I'm not sure why it came up at that point. And then I went back to chapter 1 and 2. Mm-hmm. And here, let's just right there. Oh, and you see my kind of thinking. When I have a book, I write all over the book and something. So these are not worth anything after I pass away. Maybe my children see the inner workings of my mind, but the notes here, and they're tasting notes, but the tasting notes linking itself to the story that's going to come up. So it's a precursor to it. Yeah. And I'm wondering, when did you decide to do this? Was this one of your original thoughts, or maybe later on in your book you thought about it and came back to it? I'm wondering about that specifically, because I thought it was a really cool part.
It was simply a spur of the moment, eccentric decision.
Good.
To give, literally, as in when you write tasting notes, you're trying to just summarize the experience of what's in a glass. And with the chapter tasting notes, it was a very brief paragraph to summarize what you're going to encounter in the chapter.
Yep. I thought it was great. But I didn't notice it till the third chapter. I'm not sure why, but I thought that was fantastic. It worked well. And we're on to chapter 3 now. So that's the beginning. Chapter 3 strikes lots of notes for me, because this is when you start spending a considerable amount of time buying whiskey. It's when you lay down 610 pounds and 2 pence for 8 boxes of older, higher proof single malts. Possibly the most expensive thing that you'd bought at this point. It's when you decided that you wanted a better buying experience and started frequenting odd bins. It's when you started traveling to find whiskey gems outside of the city. Gems that include many indie bottles that are where it came. You talk about high proof, non-chill filtered, no E150A. You're spending more time, mental energy, effort, and money on whiskey.
Mm-hmm.
This is the whole chapter came. So this was speaking to me quite a bit. Now, if we put your life on a graph at this point in time, I'm a math teacher. I'm sorry, Ralfy. I have to do this. Is this kind of the beginning of even more of a spike where you're still spending more, or did you get up to this point and kind of level off and then maybe dip a little bit? But did it continue up on that huge trajectory, or did you kind of level off at this point in time?
At one point, I had over 2,000 bottles of sealed whiskey.
Yeah, which you distributed amongst 4 friends for what reasons were that? And no insurance.
Just literally to split up because bear in mind, how does that look in your house insurance?
Yeah.
When you're primarily buying high strength whiskey. I mean, these bottles, you could use them as a Molotov cocktail.
Yes. And so I'm a little bit worried about that too.
But and the thing is, when you go to your insurer and say, well, can I get an extension of my policy to cover my whiskey collection?
Mm-hmm.
They won't do it. They will not do it because it's alcohol related. And they'll then start to up your premium if they're even prepared to insure you for the fabric of your house. Because it is a concentration of what they would call highly flammable, combustible fuel. So at that point, I had to split it. I was keeping it in garages, but garages tend to get warm in the summer. And I realized as soon as I moved to Isle of Man, it's time to start selling these bottles. Okay. Because some of them, I was never going to open that. You know, when you've got 50 bottles of whiskey open at one time, there really isn't any point in opening another bottle unless you're determined to overdo it and become an alcoholic. And goodness knows, I tried that once, but I never had the patience and commitment to succeed. Goodness, I like that. I say that. I throw out that quote a few times because it's quite witty, I think. You know, I've never been one for volumes of alcohol, particularly when you're sipping it. You can pace it out, and there was no way that I was doing any more than just an anorak, a geek, like a train spotter, literally getting obsessed with a specific genre of something which happened to be sealed bottles of Scotch whiskey, primarily because they were widely available at that moment in time. You know, you could go out and buy Black Bowmore for 80, 90 quid a bottle. First edition.
Wow.
I only wish I'd bought more.
Yes.
I wish I'd bought more Brora. I wish I'd bought more Port Ellen. But, you know, I have sold off quite a lot of my bottlings because you can't review this stuff. You can't review too much of what people simply can't afford to buy. Because
or they can't find, or you want it accessible.
Absolutely. So,
which is why you're doing stuff like this right now for your whiskeys of the year. Your whiskeys of the year are not a limited bottling of 120 bottles available in North America only type thing. You can't do that. So, I agree.
It's knowing just how much feedback I get as an online whiskey reviewer that people know that on the ralfydotcom channel, when they're in the Bothy, they may see a review of a whiskey that they can't actually find, but it may be a single cask from an independent bottler, but I will provide information to help them identify single cask bottlings from independent bottlers. Which, for example, if you happen to be in Canada, well, you know, it's happening in Ireland. Irish whiskey is being greatly enhanced by the presence now of Irish whiskey specialist independent bottlers. And I really look forward to seeing the same thing happen in Canada if you can circumnavigate the absurd governmental bureaucracy which is imposed on people who are generally civil and far too polite.
We are civil and far too polite. We are. But in our province, it's privatized. So you've been to Ontario, And in Ontario, there's the Liquor Control Board, or Ontario Liquor Control Board. And you have to sell so many cases, massive amounts, to break into that market. British Columbia on the other coast, same thing. We're in Alberta, and we can bring in 2 cases of something from somewhere. So we have a high amount of many independent bottlers. And that, I've been linking that to you. And well, your very last one, 1,116 independent bottlers. And I'm there with you because I love them. And SMWS was the best for us for the longest time, but there's so many other really good quality independent bottlers. But I'm off. But let's link this back to Oddbins and Cadenhead and Royal Mile Whiskies. I think Rayburn Wines, you mentioned that.
Yes.
Green Welly Stop and Lockfine Whiskies. Now, you described these to be honest, informed, experienced, and friendly.
Yes.
What else makes a whiskey shop into a fantastic whiskey shop for you? Because you've been to other countries. When you go to another country, and all of a sudden you walk in and you leave maybe 3 hours, not so much, maybe an hour later, because it's a fantastic place. What makes it fantastic for you, Ralfy?
The rapport that you can develop with the personality of the place. And a good example of that in particular would be Lochfine Whiskies, because at that moment in time, and of course it's completely changed now, the shop's owned by a much bigger whiskey company, so it's a lot lost its character. But there was two helpers in the shop. One was called Andy, the other was called Laura. And I made sure that when I drove up through the beautiful Scottish countryside, past Loch Lomond, across to Loch Fyne, so I'd make a day out of it, and I'd go up about once a month, and I'd go in literally. I'd wait till the tourist bus had kind of moved off.
Yeah.
So
Smart.
The shop had gone into a quiet spell, so I could walk in, and I'd just say, "Hi, folks, how are you getting on? What's happening?" And of course, after a couple of visits, they enjoyed the fact that there was someone in the shop who actually knew about whiskey that could give them the gossip from Glasgow. And of course, what they'd do is they'd start pouring you wee drams, tiny tasters, because there's nothing sells whiskey more successfully to a genuine whiskey drinker than getting a little taste and try before you buy.
Yes.
It works every single time. And then, of course, the conversation would go on and they'd give you something more expensive and more unusual. And, there's one point I was in the shop and I was looking at the top shelf and they had a bottle of Springbank, 1919, 50-year-old. It's distilled in 1919 at the end of the First World War, and it had been bottled in 1969. And they'd only ever bottled 12 bottles of it. And Springbank, they don't do these old bling bottles. They're understated distillery. And I looked at it and I said, "You must be joking. Who in their right mind would pay £10,000 for a bottle of whiskey?" Right? That's a lot of money. And I said,
at that time, it was they were harder to find. Not anymore.
It was highly unusual, and I said, "I tell you what, can I write you a check?" And of course I was half kidding, but the half thought, hang about, this is genuinely extremely rare whiskey. But I thought, no. Look at all the other stuff you can buy with that money, which has got phenomenal flavour. That's really that's a museum piece more than anything. Okay. Funnily enough, that bottle sold just a few years ago, an earlier edition that wasn't so well presented, for £240,000.
So you could have made a killing, Ralfy.
No, but it didn't matter, because do you know what? I've made a killing in the experience, the sheer journey. It's not about the money. If you to have enough money is to have a lot, but the money cannot buy you. These people can't pay £1 million and have the depth, the quality, and the integrity of the experience of the ordinary whiskey drinker over a decade or so. That's actually just enriched the quality of life by connecting on a deeper level and more meaningful level with something in particular, whether it be whiskey or whether it be going gold panning in a river somewhere. It just doesn't matter. It's that richness of experience that you look back and say, bear in mind, I was an undertaker. I would sit at the back of the church and I would hear people's legacies. What was left to talk or say about people after they had passed? And occasionally you'd sit there and you'd hear the most remarkable, incredible stories of completely ordinary people. And then the following day or the following week, you'd hear the most contrived flannel and filler on someone who had some sort of social status, but they'd never done anything meaningful in their life. They were a social climber. And you're a passive witness to all this. You're the man in black. You're at the back observing this. And yeah, absolutely. And I had no idea when I started that job what a rich and varied experience it would be, and just how much it would illustrate my life and lead to other opportunities. And as you say, other opportunities exist when you don't think too much about it, but just do it. And of course, as an online whiskey reviewer, that was kind of fairly late. That happened in 2009. Now, I was in Glasgow's Whisky Club in 2002. I'd gone to Bruichladdich Distillery to do their distillery course in 2004, the first Scotsman to do it. There was only 2 distilleries at that time doing anything like this. One was Springbank, and they never advertised it. And the other was Bruichladdich because they needed the money. Yeah. And what they were doing, because it was the beginning of the Bruichladdich course, they made damn sure that you went out having had a good experience, because Jim McEwen would take you into the warehouse at 4:30 in the afternoon and just give you a unique experience.
And was Renier there with you as well? Yes. Did he show up? He was there during that time? Okay. Nice.
Bless him. A larger-than-life and colourful character.
He really is. He's been to Edmonton a couple of times. I had lunch with him last year. It's fantastic, and he says what's on his mind, which I really do like. I respect that with people. Doesn't matter who's at the table, he'll let it out. I like that. I'm getting back. We need people like that in our lives. We really do.
Absolutely.
I'm going to throw another quote up. It's page 41. There we go. Click. There we are. Oh, sorry. There it is. So I now had 22 open bottles to choose from, and some were quite good, others very good. None were bad. All were better than the one bad malt. It remained unloved, but taught me a lot. And I'd like to go back to that one bad malt and let's just continue. Do you ever state in the book which expression that is? Because I looked it over again. I couldn't find what it was. And I like the quote because I have learned so much from bottles that I don't like. People don't think in those terms usually, but 2 come to mind with me. One was a corked whiskey that one of my favorite stores here in Edmonton is called Vines, and he had a corked whiskey. And during one of the tastings, we talked about and they're a wine store as well. So to smell that, the taste, but I actually tasted it. So I smelled it, but I wanted to taste it so that it would be kind of emblazoned on my memory for a while. So I did that, and that's one. And the other one is a Cavalan Solist sherry cask that showed me that there is such a thing as too much sherry. And I still have half of that bottle. When friends come over and they say they love sherry, I like to pull that out and say, there's a limit, though. There's a point. There's good and then too good, or too much, not too good. So yes. I'm wondering, did you ever say what bottle that was?
No, I never.
Okay.
But it was a bottle of 10-year-old Talisker.
Oh.
Yeah.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and that makes sense because it was 40% and chill filtered and coloring, and Talisker does that. But I enjoy a Talisker. I've had them. And well, the Distiller's Edition is really what I'm thinking of that I really like. Yeah. And yeah.
I never knew at the time what was actually wrong with it. It took me several years to figure it out. And what it was a batch from inferior casks, which contained sour casks. When casks sour, what happens is that the strength of the alcohol, which acts as an antibacterial barrier, gradually goes down over time in an empty cask until it comes to the point that there's not enough alcohol to suppress the bacterial growth, and the bacteria start to consume the sugars that remain in the cask. Right now, sherry in particular can be a very sugary concoction. So if you have a few sherry hogsheads which have been sitting in Jerez in Spain for several months waiting for the highest bidder, and then they get shipped out as sour casks, what's the producer going to do? What's the distillery going to do? And I must stress, this is purely a personal perspective and opinion. What they're going to do is they're going to either discard the cask as unsuitable, or else they're going to rinse the cask out with some new make spirit just to try and tame it down a little bit. Or alternatively, they'll wonder why that the producers, they'll phone up the bodegas in Spain and say, could you put some more sherry candles, burn more sherry candles in these casks so as to improve their shelf life from 1 month to a year? And then hence the reason you get these sulfured sherry whiskies now and again. A lot less so than used to be the case. And to be honest, in small quantities, in small presence, it's not that bad. You know, it's very assimilable, but depending on your palate.
Yes. But
this was just, it was a substandard, rank, inadequate version which had been put out as a batch, because let's face it, if you can get away with it, why wouldn't you?
Well, if people are going to buy it, but Diageo should know better, because people don't usually buy a second one after they've had a very bad one.
Yeah, right? But of course, if it's a blend, it doesn't really matter, because people aren't going to notice once they've flooded it with Coca-Cola, ginger beer, or ice. Yes. I mean, ice goes into whiskey to suppress the flavor. That's the fact of it. But when you're a single malt sipper, you really start to notice not so much the spirit itself, because that is relatively consistent in production. What it is the inadequacies, the occasional inadequacies of casks, or a number of casks within a batch. And it's not just an issue with Talisker. I've encountered it big time with Bunnahabhain. But whereas in the old days, they used to kind of shrug their shoulders and let it go, it's far more public these days, because people, the online whiskey enthusiasts, will quite rightly call it out because it is substandard product. Because a bad batch doesn't carry a price discount.
No.
Well, it'd be nice, and then you could try something different. Maybe someone would like something a little bit. I don't know. I'm trying to be nice to them. I'm getting back to the book. Actually, no. One more question with that. Have you had another bottle like that you have had that has taught you something as much as that one bottle?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Ardmore Legacy.
Oh, okay.
Dreadful stuff.
Yeah.
Shocking.
Shocking.
It's not just the big companies, and I'm not singling out corporate multinationals here. Mm-hmm. Small distilleries can do the same thing.
Yes.
And independent bottlers can do it too. They can take a bad cask, they just say, I tell you what, we'll just put it out there, it'll disappear onto the shelves. Someone will buy it, they'll kind of shrug their shoulders a wee bit, but they'll say, oh, well, that's what it must be me. It can't be the bottle. It must be me. Because not that long ago,
that's right,
when people were developing their palates,
it
was basically, the attitude was the blender knows best, the producer knows best.
We had trust, we had faith.
Absolutely. And now, quite rightly, we're questioning that faith. We're more questioning that trust. And the industry might not like it, but they also realize actually it's helping to preserve the desirability and status of the genre.
Yes.
When distilleries are producing consistently good stuff, like, for example, Isle of Arran, very good example.
Yep.
What you have is you have a trustable brand who have experienced professionals who know how to make good whiskey and know how to manage their casks. And when they have a bad cask, they basically decant to a good cask, roll out the empty bad cask, and take a sledgehammer to it out in the backyard.
You hope they do. Mm-hmm.
Or they saw it up and sell it in the local garden centre as a plant.
You know what? I'm going to read a quote that you said about, and that's all. I'm not going to add a question to it, but it's a quote that you had about barrels I liked a lot. So let's get that on there. Here, sorry.
Yeah.
It's taking an extra second to it.
A little bit of my artistic license and largesse.
I loved it. It's on page 71 if anyone has the second edition.
Do you want me to read it out myself?
You want to do that? I would love that. Yeah. Starting at, sourced, felled, or no, start wherever you want. So 71 for me. What page is it in the brand new book? Or do you have the brand new book?
Right, I better get the old book here, 71.
71 for the old book with the orange bag. So it still might be different from you. And if not, and as you're saying this, I liked when you were in the Bon Accord and you wrote you read those 2 chapters out loud. I thought that was fantastic. I love that. And I was thinking at that point, maybe you're going to have an audio book. Did that ever cross your mind? Do the whole thing?
It has crossed my mind, but there's really not the demand to justify the costs of creating an audio book.
Okay.
Because I can create an audio book instantly by just turning on the camera and just reading straight to camera.
Well, it was better in the Bon Accord. I liked the atmosphere in the Bon Accord where you did that to celebrate.
It's the right place for that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I've got the second edition, first edition book, so it's not quite the right page here.
Okay.
I'm just having a look. I'm just scanning up and down a wee bit. But I don't actually see it, so I might have to go back to you to
I will read it. I'll happily read it, but I might not have the inflection that you want, but we'll try. So, so here we go. Ready? Sourced, felled, transported, rested, milled, rested, seasoned, cut, shaped, softened, bent, shaped again, assembled, coopered, tested, toasted, or charred, or both, rested, filled, plugged, stored, months, years, decades, emptied, reconditioned, reused, eventually discarded for, and this is why I said this, for furniture, for ornaments, for wall hangings, for bar features, for burning, for smoking, for heat, for gardens, for landfill. And that's where those barrels should be going.
Yeah.
Sound good? Oh, so I added the last part where those it ended with for landfill quotes. It was a very good quote. Thank you very much. I liked it.
Oh, come on. Just that we tend to be given a very superficial and bite-sized reference to whiskey barrels. We're told, and this is one of the big lies of the Scotch whiskey industry, we're told that whiskey is made of 3 simple ingredients. And I guarantee you, Dolph, you can go on a distillery tour in Scotland in 2024, and some very well-intentioned, well-meaning, caring tour guide is going to tell you, well, all the new and etc. And whiskey is made of 3 simple ingredients: water, malted barley, and yeast. And that is simply a lie. New make spirit is made from not so simple ingredients, because there's different types of water, there's a lot of different types of yeast, and there's certainly different types of malted barley. But That's not whiskey. Whiskey needs a minimum of 3 years in wooden oak casks, not exceeding 700 cubic litres in capacity. And that is essential to transform
Are you
raw.
saying, are you going to put time into the ingredients as well? Will we call it 5 ingredients and put time?
Time is hugely important because you cannot. Malted barley is a delicate spirit. It's not corn spirit. It's not rye. And therefore, the caliber of maturation and the environment is very important, which is why people who are experienced appreciate the importance of what you'd call dunnage or warehouses or traditional warehouses, compared to modern prefabricated industrial warehouses, where it's not just the fact that it's warmer in a modern warehouse, it's just simply more industrial because it's an industrial mechanized environment, whereas a traditional dunnage warehouse, it has that dampness, it has that essential umami which transfers in time through the cask into the development of the whiskey. And you find it in rum, by the way. I'm really noticing in rum, having bottled some Foursquare recently myself under my own label, is that the rum producers are quite right in saying that tropical matured rum from the Caribbean is going to give you a more original experience than rum which has been matured in northern temperate climates. And this is very true. You know, you get much more, I would call it sunshine, the presence of sunshine in a Caribbean matured rum, where they've got, with the wild variations in barometric pressure, depending on whether it's hurricane season, and also the extremes of temperature in midday in the warehouses, and to the extent that unlike Scotch whisky, where you have this gradual incremental loss of alcohol over time, in Caribbean warehouses with rum, you have this parallel loss of water as well as alcohol. And that really changes an awful lot. And I noticed that you can get some excellent rums work and are successful a lot younger than with whiskey. In fact, one of the things you learn early on when you're getting into rum is that an old rum, a vintage rum, is just basically rather like a cognac or a fine old brandy, and it's lost its nature, it's lost its rum essence that it would have when it's in a younger, had fewer years of maturation, and the signature of the rum stills is still more prominent.
Can we equate that to the loss of flavor or loss of peat over time? Is it comparable to that or no?
To a certain extent, you could say that, but peat again with peat is it's a series of phenolic compositions.
Right.
So you have these low end flavors from long chain molecules, which are responsible for the flavor, and they tend to break down more quickly over time in the cask. They kind of become vague, understated, and subtle. And yet people will pay a fortune for really old aged Lafroigs and Ardbegs as if it's something special. No, it's not. What you want is some old bottlings of younger, more heavily peated whiskies, which is basically the old bottle effect in younger peated whiskies is far more successful than in older peated whiskies, which basically lose their magic. And in fact, one of the things, little tricks that you can do, if you've got an old Ardbeg, for example, and you've paid a lot of money for it, and it's just a little bit vague and it's all a little bit sort of geriatric.
Okay.
What you do is just add a little dash of younger stuff.
Right.
Lift it. You know, never be afraid to lift an older cask. I mean, there's distillers who will revitalize a tired old whiskey by simply taking an empty younger cask, which is technically empty, right?
Yep.
I mean, how empty is empty?
Yeah.
Well, it's when the whoever's handling the cask tells you it's empty. And fair play, it's business. I tell you, it works. It works incredibly well. So you can put a really old single malt into an empty young single malt cask that's heavily peated, and my goodness, it lifts the caliber of the old spirit.
Okay, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Gives me something else to think about, kind sir. How are you doing for time? Because you're doing well?
Yeah, fine. Carry on.
Okay, because we could stop at any time. We can come back in the future. All these are possibilities for you, just so you know. Okay.
Well, we've only made a dent in your questions, Dolph, so please carry on.
I'm on page 7, I think. All right. We're talking about quotes. Let's go back to, I have 2 quotes, and it says page 50, but I like how these 2 quotes play off of each other, and we were talking about people. So we should always be inspired by bad people and assholes. They are a living example of how we should choose to live our lives. And that's page 46. And then let's pair that with this one. It's never time wasted when in the presence of positive people. They add light to our day and affirm our humanity. That's page 50. So good and bad are part of our lives. We learn from them both. Do you have a specific example of both types of individuals? And maybe we can bring this back to the people that maybe you met at the Glasgow Whiskey Club. Was it Whiskey Club or Whiskey? No, I think Whiskey Club. I'm looking for the
Glasgow's Whiskey Club. Yeah. You know, there was one member there that I got on particularly well with, who was a very positive person, and that was, her name was Juliet. And she basically had a phenomenal nose for analysing a whiskey and was very good at talking about it, articulating it. And certainly in the early days, the club being not fashionable, it was very easy when you only had about a maximum of 20 people there, that you would get to know people by their names. And, you know, after a few whiskies, you quickly realize that you're surrounded by a few characters. I mean, one example was a very distinctive Finishman called Jarko, who...
Very flamboyant.
Sorry?
Sounds very flamboyant, right?
He is very flamboyant because he was a ballet dancer.
Okay.
An incredibly fit person who had trained because of conscription and compulsory national service in Finland. He'd been for a year. He'd been with the Finnish army and trained in their special services. Okay. And after a few whiskies, he was quite keen to tell us exactly how you go about breaking someone's neck.
Okay.
It was fascinating to know, by the way.
As long as he's not grabbing you.
Yeah, well, absolutely. But, you know, and I would kind of, you know, I'd kind of have a poke at me to see, you know, tell us about the coffins and such. And of course, I'd have to be very, very tactful, and always was. Right. But, you know, I could describe some of the families and how they behaved, and some of the horrible people, and the way they infected with their toxicity, infected the rest of the family members in a stressful situation, and undermined their ability to have a closure experience. They'd be demanding, they'd be casting up old issues, they'd be putting on the crocodile tears, which were insincere. They'd be literally champing at the bit to find out how much they'd been left in the will, or to pester another member of the family who'd somehow ended up with that valuable diamond ring that should have been given to them for sentimental reasons because it had been promised all these years ago, and sniff, sniff, boo-hoo. So, but there really wasn't anybody in the Glasgow's Whiskey Club that was a negative influence, apart from latterly. There was one old guy who was very, very cynically self-centered.
Okay.
And he'd turn up to the club. he would make a beeline for the best of the whiskey. He'd take double portions. He was very abusive of the etiquette. And to be honest, he stayed for a while because we're a polite bunch. And then he shuffled his way to the door because he wasn't really welcome anymore and realized it. So his loss, you see.
Yes, it is.
Absolutely his loss, because when people are negative and greedy, they invest in that. And inevitably, at some point, their luck starts to run out. It doesn't run out so much with the family because of this obsession that blood is thicker than water, which is always a big mistake to make. Because, family are the people we can have in our lives that are not friends and never will be friends. But they do feel entitled because of some circumstantial relationship to take a loan of you, to abuse you and expect too much of you.
Yep.
Really, the best thing you can do is just, as soon as they phone, just don't answer it. Just let them bang on the door, and will not be answered. You don't make a big song and dance of it. It's the art of blanking, and it is an art.
Okay.
You just keep them at arm's length, and with family, it works an absolute treat. When you've got a group of folk together in a whiskey club, inevitably, you can quietly and nicely,
ignore
them.
Yeah.
Even to the extent that you give them the wrong date for a whiskey night, and they turn up.
Yep.
And then who do they complain to?
Everybody.
It works. It works. Because they know fine well. All you say is, oops, sorry, it was the day before. So I misinformed you, didn't I? My apologies for that.
My fault. Me culpa.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then once they've made inquiries, they discover everybody else was there. They were the only ones that weren't. They're not that dumb that they can't put two and two together. And then they can very rapidly revise their self-created status within that environment. That's what it is.
Yep. Okay. And we'll accept that. That's good. Good people, bad people, they're part of our lives. You know how to deal with them. The older we get, it really does help. I think so. As a young man, I didn't know how to cope with those types of situations. Now, a little bit older, I'm a little bit better at that. All right.
Yes. It's the art of grumpiness.
Well, I've been known to be a little bit grumpy as well. I'm going to go back to a further question. So I'm going to go a quote from page 88. This I'm jumping around a little bit on you now, Ralfy. I'm sorry. So on this one,
apologize. We're doing fine.
Okay, so this is The Clock Ticks. Maybe you remember that one. Okay.
Hello.
Strategy, planning, and everything set up ready to go without interruptions by phone, door, or even TV, which is by far the worst interruption of all. So that's page 88. And I bring this up because we're talking about the happiness, but it kind of leads really well. Is it a lack of uninvited noises that you seek when you are looking for this alone time, this introspective time? Is it distractions? Is it noise? Is it people? Is it just everything, the white noise out there?
There's a Swedish word called hygge, right?
Yes.
Right.
You want the calm, yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And it's more than cozy. You want that perfect ambient environment where you've earned it. Time is precious. It is selfish, but it's not selfish towards others. It is self-centered, but it's also positive. It is valuing a specific environment with which you're comfortable and which you get most out of.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times over a glass of whiskey, the very best company you can keep is your own.
With your cat, maybe? with my dog maybe on the side, they add to the ambiance as well.
Depends whether they've brought a mouse in or not, and released it in the front room, and it's running around trying to find a place to hide. And there's a few places it can hide, and then the cats are jumping all over the place and knocking bottles over. That happens.
They're just trying to make you happy. They're just trying to give you a gift, Ralfy. Let's go to music with that as well, because you mentioned, I'm probably mispronouncing this, I'm sorry, but Runring, which is a Scottish Celtic rock. Bruce Gunthrow is from Nova Scotia, so that's a Canadian link there. Tannenhill Weavers and traditional Scottish music. And they have bagpipes. I think the first to put bagpipes into kind of a rock setting, maybe. And Clannad, Irish folk ride. Are these your usual choices for music on a blustery night, or do you kind of go back and forth a little bit? Because Dad was a little bit of classical music. Do you are you all over the place, or do you have a music theme that you're thinking of, or are you just eclectic? You're just going for anything?
Eclectic. It depends on the quality of the moment.
Okay.
It could be traditional Scottish folk. I mean, the thing is now, it's all available online. It's all there, and it's all in good quality. And sometimes you just come across an artist that you've never listened to before, and it just works for the moment. One recently for me, James Vincent McMorrow, who's an Irish musician, who has that wonderful Irish sensitivity to creating pictures and moments in his music, and delivers them very confidently. Or trance music, I'm very fond of trance, particularly Orasonic, but that genre, or Alpha H, and there's classic as well. I'm quite partial to the occasional divas making an appearance. Your Caballé Montserrat, or for example, let me see. Another good example would be. I'll go with. Dear. I'm having a wee senior moment here.
That's okay. I have them all the time, Ralfy.
Yeah.
Continually.
I'm kind of determined to kind of push through until I get the name here.
Okay.
Maria Callas. There you go.
There you go. Good job. I look to my wife every time I have that, and I get annoyed with her when she doesn't know what I'm trying to think of. It's a funny situation, but that'll happen too often. So the music does suit your mood, or does the music create the mood for you? I think that's what I'm getting.
Both, because when we're no longer sober, but not quite inebriated, there is this very valuable space in between, in which we have incredibly precise control, because we're consuming slowly over time with accurate addition of water to moderate the impact. And therefore we get to this in-between space that if someone was just a volume drinker, they go from sober to drunk. There's nothing in between. Whereas a whiskey sipper, you can really push out this space in between and make it last. And therefore, when you're listening to music, you simply, because of the physiology of intoxication, very mild intoxication, you actually get deeper into the music. You focus in on the music, the subtleties, and the resonance, the morphic resonance of that particular music is simply an expression of mathematics. It's audio mathematics.
Yes.
It is your Fibonacci, it is your divine ratio, it is your golden symmetry.
Yep.
It is, that's what you find in music.
Thanks for adding the math in there for me. Well, and you know what? You go towards this kind of bliss point. You talk about it, and you talk about it with water, and I do have a small quote, but I'm not going to put it up. I'm just going to read this. I like seeing people's processes in tasting and getting to know things. And for you, it has to do with cask strength, small batches. And it's only through trial and error, you say, that you navigate the perfect amount of water for adding, and you introduce it till you get to the bliss point. And it seems like you're looking for that bliss point with water. You're looking for that bliss point when you're drinking whiskey or when you're with people. I think this is a common theme as well, that you force yourself maybe, or just let yourself get taken into. So it's got to be an acquired skill, because I'm not there in all things. I look for it, but I don't think I'm getting to it as well as you are. But let's go with water, because it's the easiest one to talk about right now, really. With the whiskey bottle, and you have the whiskey in your glass, I think you go straight without the water first.
Yes.
But I'm guessing, because when we see you online, often you don't have it first, and you put the 2 spoons or the 1 spoon of water in it, but you do start without the water.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. I just wanted to get that in. Just get that one little point. I'm going to go to another one. So I had a damn good reason for them to attend. And so I'm going to chapter 7, if this is okay. This chapter, I had a lot of questions with this. So I had a damn good reason for them to attend. Whiskey, I would offer them whiskey, the water of life, the alchemic fusion of fire and water. That's page 91. And that's a great quote. I love how you brought that together. And referring to the philosophers taking center stage in chapter 7. I had many questions about this chapter, and it ranged from your reasoning for the Chestershire cat. Why did the philosophers have different whiskeys in your dream than they did prior to your dream? Because you tell us the lineup that you had then. Why did Socrates and Plato, why did you play that up so much? Maybe they had the biggest influence, or maybe you read the most about them. I was just wondering. But really, what's most important for me to know is, where did you want to bring the reader with this chapter? The Philosophers Picnic.
The notorious chapter 7, right in the middle of the book, you have this surreal change of direction, where you're into this dreamscape, quite literally. And I don't explain it as such, but there's times where you go to bed after a good whiskey session and you have complete dreamless sleep. Other times, because purely of circumstances, and this is where mild intoxication can alter reality, and you have the most vivid of dreams. And I've had dreams where I've been on other planets, and I've had dreams where I've been getting chased through distilleries by malt monsters. And I have had dreams where I've been suddenly put on the spot to organize a picnic for the world's greatest philosophers. And of course, it all kind of goes completely pear-shaped, because
you can't control these philosophers. They do whatever they want.
Well, the philosophers turn up, and as they were, I mean, these were really cantankerous people in real life, because many super intelligent, creative, and outstanding people are. You know, they say it's always a risk to meet your heroes, because once you're disappointed, you'll never be undisappointed. And it's very true. And it was actually a conversation I'd had with someone who was an anthropologist philosopher, who was talking about the fact that much of history is received wisdom imposed as a distraction from what's really happened, in order to sustain the orthodoxy of a narrative and to control the wider population. Now, in the internet age, that is really starting to crumble now, and it's fascinating to witness it. But it's not that long ago where you went to school, you learned about English kings and Shakespeare, and that was it. You were given your dollop, your dose of, this is what history is. just get on with it, go and do your day job and don't think twice about it. That's you programmed. Whereas an anthropologist who has access to academic journals and books, which are simply not and never will be available to members of the public, they start to get a very different take. And when they discover that one philosopher's actually been having an absolute bitch about another philosopher because they had a wine meeting and basically the wine was so inferior that he'd overdosed it with herbaceous supplements to mask the awfulness of the wine, that it was a very bad night. So they weren't going to go to any of their parties again, and they weren't going to invite them to another party. And this is all documented. You know, this is and much of what the Greek philosophers talk about is in fact being inherited from the Egyptians, because in Egypt, all we're told about Egypt is pyramids and sphinxes, and yet the amount of intellectual knowledge which came from the Egyptian philosophers, the Egyptian sages, it's been completely written out of the history books because it was reappropriated for the palatable convenience of Greek philosophers' reputations, whether it be Epictetus, Epicurus. I thought Epictetus was in fact. I think he was in fact. He wasn't Greek. He was a Scythian. And of course, we hear very, very, very little about Indian philosophers and the incredible wisdoms that you find in the ancient Sanskrit texts, including the Mahabharata. And of course, if you look at the phenomenal antiquities of the Sumerian age and how much was documented, we get virtually nothing of that. And of course, the final, something that's kind of local to Scotland, of course, is this absurd myth that the Druids never wrote stuff down. They committed it all to memory. Now, this is complete nonsense. They did write it down, except what they wrote down has been secreted away into archives and is never made available to the public. Because the language is there. It's called ogam or right? It exists. You know, philosophers do not live within societies that have written language and not use it. It's irrational. So this kind of gets sort of condensed into this surreal moment halfway through the book, which I seriously thought of just cutting out completely. But I thought, no, it's there for a reason. Perhaps in time it will start to make sense. And so hopefully it does. But if anybody questions the content of my book, that's the chapter they tend to home into and say, what's this all about? This is absurd. This is nonsense. It's nothing to do with whiskey. Why did he put it in there? And the simple reason it's in there because it relates to whiskey, because whiskey is capable of creating profound, original psychedelic moments. Okay.
That's perfect. That's the perfect ending to that question. And I'm going to give you this question. And first of all, thank you for explaining chapter 7, because it was a surprising chapter for me, but I like how we brought it together at the end right here. And I'm going to ask you this question, and then I'm going to leave for a second so I can find 2 props for the next question. So don't be surprised if I take off on you. So you depart 2 situations that I believe defined and molded you. So your funeral director position, and I think it was a good thing, as may be evident by this quote. So, and this is on page 155. So one big thing I learned whilst being a funeral director in a big city was that at the end of it all, no one gives a damn, save for a few tears from decent people and beneficiaries. We live. I got a kick out of this. We live, we piss, we shit, we eat, we die. One of billions of players, each acting their part in the stage of life. So that's page 155. People should look at that. And then the other thing, I'm wondering if you had the same, because this seems very guttural. It seems very emotional.
So, did you have the same guttural feeling when you left Glasgow Whiskey Club in 2010, which was changing, as everything eventually does, but maybe not for the better? But maybe we don't answer that. Maybe people can just read this book to get some insight as the funeral director and how they left that. But I would like to find out about why you left the club. And it's not a full exit, because you do come back later on, I believe.
Absolutely.
You still visit, right? You still talk to the people. So I'm going to leave, but I'm still in the room. I'm just looking for 2 little vials. I'll be right back.
So
I can still hear you.
Okay. So let me explain leaving Glasgow's Whiskey Club. It was, there's this kind of superficial emotion. You've got friends there. There's a lot of shared journey. But in leaving Glasgow's Whiskey Club, there was a very specific, distinctive reason for doing so. It wasn't that I fell out with anybody. It wasn't because I was fed up with whiskey. It was because I was giving up my job and leaving Glasgow to move to the Isle of Man to look after my mother, to make sure she didn't have to go into a care home. So I basically became her full-time carer, which I was very happy to do, to give her an extra 10 years of good quality of life in her own home. And at the same time, there was a financial reason for it, because nursing homes are very expensive. And in my opinion, there are impersonal environments, and people are too quick to accept that as an option, particularly in relation to the cost. And it would have cost my mother over £1,000 a week. Right, that's £4,000 a month for this basic care. And as she had dementia, it would probably be extra costs on top of that for specialised nursing, and I thought, this is crazy. Am I going to continue working as an undertaker in Glasgow, paying the level of tax that I do, working the overtime I do, when in fact at the other end I'm losing my inheritance? And if I have to sell the house, it's highly likely I would be paying inheritance tax on that. So it was a no-brainer. There was a strong sentimental reason to look after my mother, because I knew the value of that being an undertaker, and I was perfectly confident I could do it. And also, I saved an absolute ton load of money. And because I'm a qualified embalmer, I had no problem getting a part-time job on the island where I work freelance. And also, this gave me more time to dedicate to growing and building and developing my actual online review channel, opening up a Patreon page, having subscribers who get live streams, they get additional videos. And it's been great to reward my Patreon subscribers, not only with additional content, but when it came to any specific ralfydotcom bottlings, they get first refusal. They get the first chance. So to celebrate 1,000 reviews, I've put out, there's a total of 5 bottles, 5 single cask bottlings, 3 of my own, from my own collection of casks, which are ready. There was a 15-year-old Foursquare rum, matured for 2 years in a Madeira cask, 10-year-old Glenord, full term in an ex-bourbon, first fill bourbon cask, and a 19-year-old Bruichladdich, which had filled in a cask myself back in 2004, spent its entire term in one cask. And then 2 guest bottlings, one with Signatory for a 16-year-old super high strength Glenlivet, a fresh sherry cask, and also Ardmore, one of the most exciting and genuinely flavour innovative new distilleries on the scene in Scotland, with a bottling of their 7-year-old single cask heavily peated whiskey, which was an absolute banger. And I don't make any money. I make money out of my own casks, because I've got to kind of finance them some way. But I make sure that it's kind of reflected in the prices that I charge.
But your most recent one, your face on the side of it, and that is your most recent one. Through the independent bottler. Sorry.
Yeah, I've got my own independent little micro independent bottling company, because I own a number of casks just for the experience of actually looking after them and seeing how they develop, and learning more about maturing whiskey, which is the absolute core of whiskey knowledge, is the actual caliber of casks, maturation of whiskey, and the fact that in the future it will go beyond oak. There will be spirits, malted barley spirit matured in other woods, cherry and chestnut. It's already happening in the USA. But also the reintroduction of inner staves, I think, is hugely influential and important. Everything from rowan, birchwood, indigenous oaks, and other indigenous
and
trees.
maple, Japanese oak. Sorry,
No,
Dr.
absolutely.
Dawn from JP Weiser's is doing that quite a bit right now, and I'm really enjoying those. And yeah, mesquite wood. Like, there's so many things happening right now. It doesn't mean they're all great or a fantastic caliber. These are great, but my wife says in the background, make sure he knows that these are fantastic. But I like the experimental, and I was wondering about you. I didn't know if you were leaning more towards the traditionalist area where you wouldn't accept the staves coming in, or for these ones, it's not staves, but they make the tops of the barrels, so they replace the top of the barrel specifically and do that. Are you okay with that? You're good?
Yeah, I think that it's now a time that, you see, the Scotch whisky industry in particular is overly conservative. They're very much, because it's worked in the past, sort of, apart from the 1980s. Yes. It's worked in the past, therefore, let's just stick with it. Mm-hmm. And therefore, it's been rather hard, and it's partly to do with British culture, which is very much increasingly stuck in the past. It's not a contemporary culture. But I do think there will be a few Scotch whisky distilleries which actually break the mold and mature their malted barley spirit, formerly known as whisky, but rebadged as British matured spirit.
Wow.
And everyone, oh yes.
Okay.
Yes, it will be matured with inner staves. And the Scotch Whisky Association can't say a thing about it because it's not being presented as Scotch whisky.
It's theirs.
They're there to represent the interests of the Scotch whisky industry, not Scotch whisky distilleries producing other styles of whisky which happen to be similar to Scotch, but to be innovative as well, but are not being branded and presented as Scotch single malt whisky. And you've got it's happening with rum, with Andean oak, with Amburana wood. You have the Brazilian whiskey industry finding its feet, producing some really interesting stuff that are only just trickling out now from the Union Distillery, finding its way into the Scottish independent bottlers. And, it's exciting stuff. Scotch whisky is really going global, and very important part of that's Canadian whiskey. Canadian whiskey is severely underrepresented on the world whiskey stage because Canadian whiskey has basically been suppressed in its reputation for too long.
Well, and they've been pumping out a lot of the well drinks for a very long time as well. So they've done a little of the hurt to themselves, but I do review Canadian whiskeys, and I'm loving my Canadian whiskeys. But let's go back. I tried to leave. I tried to find E150A. I've got 2 vials of it, and because you talk about that. Anyone that's listened to your vlogs know that you have a problem with E150A, and you should be banned. You say banned completely. Forget it.
From single malts, not from blends.
Okay. Sure. What fewer people know is that you seem to be okay with Paxorette. One, I just wanted to show you the 2 E150As, and I was going to ask you, because there's a slight color difference. One seems to be browner, the other one redder, and they were both E150A. So I was wondering if you had some type of, I don't know, could understand why one was more red and the other one more.
Yeah, I can understand that. And it's simply the actual recipe used at the industrial facility in which they create E150A on a commercial level. And it's not as if if you and I are making E150A caramel cullen in our home in the kitchen, we'll basically put the sugar in the pot, put some water in, a little bit of acid to kind of bring things along a little bit, and then bubble it up until it turns to a more or less burnt toffee and starts to smoke. And then we'll gradually add cold water and it will fizzle and hiss and all the rest of it. But rather than solidifying as burnt Scotch toffee, it will actually become this homemade E150 substitute. But in fact, if you put that into whiskey, it's no problem at all. It doesn't impact anything negative to the whiskey. But commercial E150A is made in a massive stainless steel vat by burning the sugar or sugar beet with very strong acids and then neutralizing it with very strong alkalis. That's an industrial process.
So I'm guessing it's two different industries that have done it then, or two different. Well, okay, good. Well, and you're okay with Paxorette though, and we talk about that. And you're not the only one. I've talked to Davin de Kergamo, who you know, and he loves Paxorette. He does. He's got a place in his heart for it, and I think it's because when he was growing up or getting into Scotch as a young man, it was far more common. So I think he was doing that. And for anybody, that's this gentleman here. Right,
and the gentleman he is too. Wonderful chap.
And I'm interviewing him for this book. He's got a 3rd edition coming up to that one right away.
Good. Yeah.
But he loves Paxorette, and you're okay with Paxorette as well. And I'm wondering if you could tell me why. Make the distinction for me between E150A and Paxorette and why one's okay with you and not. You state it in the book, but I just wanted to.
Basically, Paxorette is a proprietary brand of PX sherry, concentrated PX sherry, which has been enhanced with E150A, or a permutation of E150A. And the thing is that Paxorette is not added at the end of maturation in the holding tank of a bottling plant. E150A is. It's the first point that E150A meets the whiskey itself is literally hours before it actually gets bottled, and therefore it shocks the whiskey. And importantly, E150A will cosmeticize the whiskey, so people look at it and say, oh, look how dark it is. Isn't that wonderful flavor?
Yes.
Look at the color. And people, the passive consumer, they're quite happy with that. Although I do notice that in proprietary brands of blended Scotch, the actual volume of E150A between bottlings can vary significantly depending on which supermarket you're in and which batch has been produced for which retailer. So Paxorette, you see, isn't added at the end. It's added at the beginning in the cask, in a tired cask. And a tired cask, for example, it may not have a lot of previous content, but it still has something to give out the wood, particularly if it's been shaved, recharred, and importantly, given any decent quality of toasting. So the Paxorette will actually cushion the woodiness of the cask by giving this sherry type of dimensionality to the maturing spirit. And with its viscosity and sweetness, it will also mellow out slightly rough spirit that's come off an overworked still. Now, this is something that you really start to spot when you're at the auction houses and you're buying old bottlings of, say, the likes of 21-year-old White and Mackay. You can distinctly pick up in the Paxorette and you're thinking, actually, that Paxorette from that generation, while it was still legal to use it, is of better quality of delivery than these modern contrived sherry casks, which are juiced with contemporary sherries, which are going to be shortly heading off after the casks have been emptied to be turned into balsamic vinegar.
Perfect. That's it. And was Paxorette was widely available when you were kind of getting into it in the 70s as well, right? Do you remember the year that it was outlawed?
Right.
That's what I'm trying to get.
No, I don't, because I was not around whiskey in the 70s.
Not at all. Just the 80s. Okay.
I was at school in the 70s.
Okay.
When I was buying whiskey in the 80s, it really wasn't, I wasn't aware of it. I wasn't noticing it in single malts, although it may have been there. It may have been added to sherry casks, to super sherry, malts like Glengrant, which are genuinely work with sherry, or Aberlour is another good example, particularly the early versions of the Aberlour Abernat, which the early versions batches from 7 through to 19 were just phenomenal. I mean, that was that old generation of sherry casks that actually matured sherry, because in the 1980s, people were drinking sherry in Britain. It was being imported from Spain in lorries over the English Channel and being stored in warehouses in Bristol, because Bristol was the home of sherry in the UK, hence brands like Bristol's Bristol cream sherry. And cream sherry is simply PX sherry, it's sweet sherry. And they would have a particular sweet sherry. It was so cloying, a dessert sherry, and we'd say, well, we can't bottle that. Let's just put it into litre bottles and send it up the road with the empty sherry casks to the Scotch whisky industry. Because what are we going to do otherwise with these sherry casks? Nobody wants them. So that's what they did. And I mean, I remember that, we'll have a sweet sherry, a dry sherry. It was an acquired taste by people of a certain generation. And I have to say, when you taste sherry now, it's pretty much of a non-event compared to other fortified wines like Madeira and port, particularly port.
Okay. Well, we've settled that. E158, Paxorette good, E158 bad. Unless we make it ourselves. And I tried to do that. I've got to tell you, I had a walk, and because I thought it would stir better in the walk as it was coming up, I made a mess of it. I think maybe I cooled it too fast, and then it became, it was hard right away. There was a point that I missed, even with the water, and I tried to include more water as it was getting harder, and I gaffed it up. And that was really probably an hour of my life, and I should have done it again. But I didn't.
So long as you enjoyed yourself, and bear in mind, you've a nice block of homemade toffee at the end of it.
I tried. No, it was horrible. I'm sorry. It was so two things to end it off. So one, let's talk about your vlog. So the genesis of your vlog, and that comes in. There's a poor presenter, and we were talking about the club. Poor presenter at one of the whiskey club meetings, and Julia tells you could do better, and you agree with her. I agree. I could do better. And then there's an incident that gets you off work for 2 months. Your brother tries to convince you to just to get busy, keep yourself a little bit busy. You take the plunge. You seize the moment. And I like that you had the internal fortitude to do that, because you're jumping into the unknown. And do you think that you would have eventually presented yourself online, if not from the prompting of those that you loved and respected type thing? Or did you need the prompting, or would you maybe have gotten there one day?
No, you see, timing's important. I just happened to start at the right time in 2009. And one of the instigators, by the way, because there is a Canadian connection, a very strong Canadian connection to the beginning of ralfydotcom as an online whiskey reviewer. And that was Glenbretton, Glenora Distillery, because I was absolutely incensed that the Scotch Whisky Association was intimidating and, in my opinion, it's an opinion, bullying a small Canadian distillery for presenting Canadian whiskey as being too Scottish because they were using the word Glen. Now, let's put this into context here. This is a small distillery in Nova Scotia, right? 60 miles south of Inverness, Nova Scotia, that is inhabited by the heirs and the legacy of the original Scottish settlers who were kicked off the land and kicked out their country and booted out their society by the established Anglo-centric establishment. And they turn around and have the audacity, and frankly, there's a strong racist aspect to this.
Okay.
Which in 2009, it wasn't really much of a feature. But recently, when the Scotch Whisky Association were going after Macaloney's distillery in British Columbia,
I have that too.
how dare they? Who the hell do they think they are? If they want to offend the Scots people, the Scottish nation, and Scottish culture, what a great way to go about it. To try and to victimize, single out, and tell Macaloney's that they can't, yes, Caledonian whiskey. Canada has an authentic, genuine, unique Scottish legacy.
We do. And we're proud of it.
And proud of it, and is absolutely legitimate. And the sheer ignorant, ill-informed arrogance, that Anglo-Saxon establishment arrogance coming out of Edinburgh and London, frankly, it's disgusting. It's just disgusting, and it really, really pissed me off. And bear in mind, Macaloney, they're saying, oh, you can't use it. Macaloney's a Scottish name. Macaloney's an Irish name.
Is it?
Can they not even tell the difference? Are they so culturally inept? This is one of the things about that, and you've got in India one of the biggest distilleries, McDowell's, but lips are sealed, not a problem, nothing said. And I tell you what, they wouldn't dream of going after Glendalough in Ireland.
Okay. We're just nice in Canada. They get to push us around a little bit. That's okay. But they fought for it. And this is the one they put out. So it was the 10-year-old, but then after they won the battle, they had the 15. I was going to ask you, did you go to that distillery?
Story here, though, because the original owner of Glenora Distillery, he had to sell his distillery. It did affect his health. It cost him an awful lot to fight that battle, and it should never have happened. Never have happened. And this is one reason why I'm not just a Scotch whisky reviewer. I review whiskies from all over the world. I regard myself as an international citizen.
Good.
The way real Scottish people from real Scottish culture define themselves. We're not parochial, sanitized and cliched and cosmeticized by some blurbing reworking of Sir Walter Scott. How condescending, how introvert and narrow-minded. This is Britain's in big trouble at the moment, and a lot of that trouble's of its own making, and it's not easily sorted because they can't kick the habit of that narrow-minded, inwardly neurotic, preposterous mindset. You know, the world's the British Empire is gone. I know that it still exists financially. It still exists financially, but do you know what? Change has never been more changeable than it is now.
Well, I'm really happy that you brought the clearances into Nova Scotia and our heritage. That was fantastic. And that's what you tried on your first Flip Cam Ultra HD. Now, did you put that out at any point in time?
Yeah, absolutely. It went as review number 2.
Because I've seen it then, because I went back
because I started watching your vlogs probably 4 years in, I'm guessing. But when I first started, I did go back to the beginning. Because when you search you on, and it always has number 1, 2, 3 at the very bottom on YouTube. They show the very first ones that you have. So I missed that. I have to look for that again. So thank you for that. And my wife and I had a great discussion about this as well, because we thought, what would happen if we could never use our respective homelands? You wouldn't have New York, you wouldn't have New England, Nova Scotia wouldn't be allowed to have Little Italy, New Berlin for us in Canada. So many things would be stopped just because of that prevailing attitude. So
it's a lot deeper than that. It's not just place names. Place names are important, and there's so many Scottish references are right across Canada. But the legacy is far deeper than that. I mean, are you aware that the King of England owns 89% of Canadian land?
No.
No.
I did not know that.
Check it out.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Remember, you're part of the Commonwealth.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah. Well, and I'm proud of you.
Whose wealth is it got in common?
Well,
right?
I was okay. I was more okay when it was the Queen. But anyways, let's leave that. That's okay. Here's my last quote. My very last quote. And this is for you. No one else, really. Whiskey, along with other quality spirits made for sipping, not swigging, appears to build bridges in collective human goodwill. And it's because of whiskey that I've had the good pleasure to get to know you better over these, my goodness, 2.5 hours. Thank you. Whew. And this book club and reading your books. And I do love this, because the insight when you read an author and you read what they think is important, want to present to other people, that's great. And so thank you very much. Thank you very much, Whiskey, for doing that for us as well. And any last comments for you, kind sir, before I wrap this all up?
Absolutely, because what you're discussing, just to add further to what you're saying, is that there is an increasingly mature global whiskey community, which really crosses so many borders and is very positive in bringing people together from many different cultures with one common purpose and one common point of reference. And it's the internet that's done it, nothing else. The books have their place. The magazines can occasionally be entertaining if you can get past the adverts. But the real game changer has been the internet, and the internet is far from finished. It's only actually just beginning. And it's been fascinating for me, Dolph, to when I started with a flip cam, with such low resolution, unplugging my telephone line so I could tap into the modem and wait for the modem to boot up. And how much has actually changed, because I've got a ringside seat to all this, not just in whiskey, but with other stuff that's going online. And there is such a cosmopolitan globalization, which is positive. And the responsible consumption of high-end alcohol, quality alcohol, majorly contributes to that in all its identities from all its locations. And I'm delighted that despite the various challenges over the decades, Scotch whisky, single malt whisky in particular, still holds a prominent place, despite the fact that, I mean, there's such great characters out there: Mortlach, Springbank, Edredour, Glenfarclas, etc. But, you know, it could do more. It could be more. And I think that it struggles to adapt to how quickly things are moving. A very exciting time for us all, for the passionate people, because we're the fundamental bedrock to this entire industry.
Ooh, I like that.
Oh, yeah. The whiskey sippers are the ones who are invested, who know what quality is, who understand quality and who call out online when quality is not there. We are a major endorsement of new distilleries making quality, investing in quality, and delivering quality, which without us, there would be nowhere near the same incentive for them.
Okay. Perfect final notes. That was great. That was a perfect Ralfy rant. I like it. And that's how we're going to end it. That's all the time we have today, whiskey friends. It's been a fantastic afternoon for me. Thank you to our listeners that showed up on the side. Thank you to those that will come in the future, because that's mostly who come on. Thank you, Ralfy. It's been an absolute pleasure spending this afternoon with you, and I hope you had as much fun as I did. And I'm going to invite you back in the future when you want to do kind of part two to the first part, and then and then that one right there, or any order. We don't have to go in order for 2 to 3, but now you know you're devoting yourself to quite a few hours. I think if we do it this way, maybe I'll reduce the amount of questions if possible. Anyway, or book number 4. But thank you very much. It was great, and here I am signing off. Join us for the 3rd edition, ladies and gentlemen, of Davin de Kergamo's Canadian Whiskey. That was volume 1. That's volume 2. And I think Davin will be here in my basement with me in April, and we'll have our own couple hours talking about Canadian whiskey and the whiskey past. I hope you're there. Hope you liked your time here. Click like, subscribe, all that. And if you have a glass, kind sir, anything left in it, we'll hold it up. Here's the good company. Left. You, sir. Up there. Here's the good whiskey. Here's the good books. Here's the good conversation.
And here's your good lady.
Thank you all. And my lovely wife, Laura, is cheersing you in the background. She's trying to get her thing in here. Cheers, everybody.